Good evening. I'm Father Russ Carmichael, and this is Street Talk. And we're on live, and I'm probably going to surprise a lot of people tonight. I have a great guest. I'm going to tell you about my great guest in a minute. Across from me, obviously, is my co-host, Dominic Cotton. He's right here with me. I want to thank all you people for letting me back in your home, for being able to talk to you, and hope you're all warm and snuggly after this snowstorm. The other thing I want to make sure that we say, we're really concerned about Andy. Hope Andy, Senator Maynard, is doing well. We always our prayers for him. We know he's back to work, and you're getting his notices over the internet. So we're saying hi to Andy out there. And later on, we got a special going on. Later on tonight, we have Senator Osteen, who's back with us, as always, a great guest for us. But right now, this show I've been waiting to do a long time. Sitting across from me, I have Donald Williams, and I'm glad to have you here. Okay, past president of Senate. Okay, 10 years.
10 and a half years.
10 and a half years in the state Senate. He
as president.
As president, as president of the Senate. Excuse me, as president of the Senate. But what I'm going to talk about tonight is, for me, one of the best books, and I'm not blowing you smoke at all, I have ever read, and I believe everyone should read this. We're doing a lot of shows concerning what's going on racially around the country and everything else. Historically, every person in Connecticut should read this book. Absolutely. Okay? And I love the way you write. Okay? The detail and the work that went into this. Prudence Crandall, okay? Well, I'm going to let Don explain who it is, why he done it, and everything else. But this, anybody concerned with our social issues that are going on right now should read this book. I have others I want you to read too, but I'm serious. Don, I love the book.
Thank you, Russ.
I really do.
Dominic, great to see you.
Okay,
yeah.
It's a history that most people don't hear about.
No, matter of fact, when I was first elected to the state Senate in the early 1990s, I didn't know anything about the Prudence Crandall story. And her schoolhouse is in what used to be my district, the 29th District, Northeastern Connecticut. It's in Canterbury. And for those who don't know, she was a school teacher. She taught school in the early 1830s. She had a school of her own, which was very unusual for a woman to own the schoolhouse, to run the school, hire the other folks at the school. And it was very successful. And she was teaching the white daughters of the folks in and around Windham County. And one day, a friend of one of the servants at the school, Mariah Davis, who was black, her friend Sarah Harris, who was also black, asked Prudence Crandall if she could be a student, because Sarah wanted to be a school teacher, teach other black children in the future. Prudence Crandall didn't answer right away. There was no segregation in Connecticut by law, but by social custom, the races went their separate ways for the most part, even in the North at that time. And so when Sarah came back and asked a second time, Prudence Crandall said yes. The students accepted Sarah as a student in their classroom, no problem. But when the parents found out, that's when everything broke loose at that point. The parents responded very adversely. The town fathers tried to get Prudence to expel Sarah. And then finally, the state legislature, to its shame, passed a law called the Black Law, which prohibited the education of Prudence Crandall's black students there at the school. And what happened was she had to decide whether she would continue to operate and essentially commit an act of civil disobedience or expel Sarah. Well, she kept her school going. She was arrested, put in jail for a night. Her trials, Crandall versus State, were the first civil rights trials in the history of the United States.
In the US,
and they took place right here in Eastern Connecticut.
Every lawyer needs to read this. Every lawyer, right? I mean, this is not, okay, this is a white story and the black story. And that's why it's so important. It's the issues that Dominic and I are talking about. We've been on the TV. We had Carolyn Vermont on and Dennis, and we're talking about these issues. I mean, the history, number one, is so rich, but it's a history that...
I didn't know. I'm educated in Connecticut, been here since I've been 8 years old. And I've been through the whole school system, and like you, this until I read this book, this is the first that I've ever heard of Prudence Crandall and really how it relates to where we are today.
And folks all throughout Connecticut were involved in this story. It's a story about, as you said, Russ, both white and black folks coming forward, standing up for equality. You had certainly Prudence Crandall, William Lloyd Garrison, who was a white publisher of the most famous anti-slavery newspaper, The Liberator, in Boston. You had other folks like the Burleigh family, William and Charles Burleigh, white anti-slavery activists, Samuel May, a Unitarian minister in Brooklyn. These were just some of Prudence Crandall's allies. But then you had Sarah Harris, a young black woman who was standing up for her ideals and her own education. Mariah Stewart, who wasn't directly involved, but she was arguably one of the first black women activists to stand up for the rights of blacks against slavery and pro-education.
Exactly,
David Walker, someone else who was not directly involved, but a black activist leader in Boston who had a tremendous impact on William Lloyd Garrison and therefore the anti-slavery movement. You had all these folks coming together in Connecticut, as well as leaders in Boston, New York, Providence, Philadelphia, and so forth. But the way it weaves through, especially eastern Connecticut, up in the Northeast, Canterbury, Brooklyn, Wyndham, Norwich, then down to New Haven, Hartford, folks from almost all corners of this state coming together in one way or another as part of this story.
Well, because it's education, a lot of people don't know the history of education, how it develops. I mean, this is why these things are so important. This history, basically, what you wrote about, I mean, I take it because of my own studies, expanded the education, how we developed into into Massachusetts, where sections of Massachusetts developed programs for interracial stuff based on these educational systems and the law. I mean, we're talking about how our laws developed and the struggle, and it's real. What I found so interesting, it really centers here, okay, in Canterbury and develops here. But if you follow it, it goes all the way to Europe. It goes all the way to, and back and forth because of all the wonderful characters that you talk about. Each a serious leader in their own right, and through that whole development. I mean, this. This should be a movie. I really am. And the tragedy is, so many people don't know. That's our hidden past in the shadows and stuff like, that is not talked about and continues to have a lot of problems. If we only understood the rich foundation of how blacks and whites work together to try to get over this immoral issue of keeping people down, making laws against them climbing up the ladder of success and being accepted in society. But you gotta be. This is such a great book. I love this book.
Well, thank you, Russ. And one of the things that really captured my interest, the more I researched this and found out about it, was that yes, it's a fascinating story about the abolitionist movement, the anti-slavery movement in the 1830s, 40s, 50s. An amazing story about Prudence Crandall's courage and her heroism in educating young black women at a time when she was persecuted and threatened as a result of that. But the more I found out about this and researched it, and I realized her story touched directly two of the most fateful U.S. Supreme Court cases in our history. The Dred Scott case,
Scott, yeah.
which helped lead to the Civil War, where her case was cited for all the wrong reasons, because of a Judge David Daggett who said that blacks are not citizens, a Connecticut gentleman, by the way, from New Haven. But then her case and the arguments that her attorneys made reaches all the way to 1954, and perhaps the most historic civil rights case in our history, Brown versus Board of Education, which ended segregation, where one of the historians who advised the attorneys for the NAACP in Brown, Howard J. Graham, cited the arguments by Prudence Crandall's attorneys, arguments that argued in favor of black citizenship, in favor of due process for all black citizens. He cited those arguments as the underpinnings for the 14th Amendment, which was the grounds that the Supreme Court used to overrule the separate but equal standard that had allowed segregation. So that argument helped strike down segregation in our schools, which, when you think about it, was what Prudence Crandall was all about. When she admitted Sarah Harris as a black student into her classroom of white young women,
Right.
she had, at that moment, created an integrated classroom.
Right.
And that's what the town fathers and the state legislature in the 1830s objected to. It took us 100+ years to 1954 to get to the point where, in this country, under our laws, the Supreme Court finally said, in so many words, you know what Prudence Crandall did back then is okay. That should be the law of the
It should
land.
be the law of the land and the standard.
I know for me, when I take a look at, and I certainly like to be able to look at things as a whole picture, you can really see the pendulum kind of swing backwards and forth within the story. I mean, taking back to the early days of our founding fathers, through the abolitionist movement, through the Civil War, where you think it's going on an upswing, and then it kind of swings back down through, the Jim Crow laws
Right.
and the 20s, until it comes back around to Brown versus Board of Ed, and starts swinging in the other direction. And you can see society kind of grappling with this back and forth.
You're right. I mean, we forget sometimes that even though virtually every one of the founding fathers said at different times that slavery is terrible and that we must end it, virtually every founding father owned
Was a
slaves.
slave.
Only John Adams
Yeah, right,
was
exactly.
someone who
Someone who
did not own slaves, but
Right.
George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, Patrick Henry, John Jay, on and on and on, were slave owners, and they were not able to reconcile this unbelievable conflict between Thomas Jefferson on the one hand, writing in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal, at the same time allowing human bondage, slavery in the United States. But you're right, even after the Civil War, and after the adoption of the 14th and 15th Amendments, ending slavery, providing for due process for all, we saw the end of Reconstruction, the rise of, like you said, the Jim Crow laws. And then there's that picture, I put the photograph in the book, in the 1920s. Here is a Ku Klux Klan march in Washington, D.C., this picture with the U.S. Capitol, the dome of the Capitol in the background, and then in the street just filled with Klansmen and women dressed in their white robes marching down Pennsylvania Avenue. It sort of takes your breath away, and you're reminded we're not a post-racial society. Even today, we have grappled with these issues, and in the light of the grand jury decisions in the Michael Brown case and Eric Garner, these are still issues that we grapple with.
This is, for me, I mean, it's a big deal for me. Historically, I have my ancestors, Scott, relative in the 1700s, anti-slavist, said no, his philosophical thing was no man should own another man. It's morally reprehensible and stuff like that come through that system. And of course they obviously were having the struggles in Europe and everything else to do away with slavery and stuff like that. You got slaves when you had wars and stuff like that. So the issue the hardest place for me to look at is our country has had the worst system of slavery than any other place. That should have been ended, and we should have got over this, but for some reason it continues in insidious ways. Okay, that we haven't all as a people grappled with this. It's an immoral situation.
And the North was complicit. A lot of folks think of, well, that's right. Slavery was
Seriously, yeah.
Folks will think slavery was terrible, but that was something that happened in the South.
Yeah.
We were all for eliminating slavery, and we were all for equality for all in the North. Well, of course that's not true.
Of course it isn't.
And the northern bankers and the merchant marine trade and the insurance folks and everybody down to the carpenters and blacksmiths, the people who built the ships, and folks who were making rum. Everybody was in on this.
In it,
and we were building the slave ships. We were financing the missions. We were distilling the rum that was then taken to Africa to use to buy the slaves, and then bringing the slaves back and selling them in Cuba and up and down the coast, beginning, of course, in the South. But in the 1700s, you're right, in the 1700s, there were slaves right here in Connecticut. And we were one of the last New England states to abolish slavery entirely in 1841.
Of course, you grew up in Newton. I learned about Jackson Homestead and the Freedom Trails and all this stuff. You're getting all this education, which a lot of places didn't teach all of those things, right? But they were trying, I can't think of the system that they were using, treat all us kids to integrate and understand stuff. They taught about the Freedom Trail going out. They never taught about the the trail going back, where bounty hunters and everything else paid money to capture people, steal people, kidnap people, and send them down south and sell them. They never talked about that. You had to learn it through other ways and in your older education. Never taught in high school. Never was told all of that stuff. And just because I was fortunate to have a good history Zen, Howard Zen, who was a good history teacher and came from where I lived. I learned that you need to find out about history, Russell. It may not be what you think. And this is why I just love this. I mean, this hits on exactly the issues that we were talking about, and we have people coming back on that are discussing these present issues and laws about what's going on. Nobody really talks about it. Nobody takes the responsibility from the white society that we did a lot of this stuff right here in New England and stuff like that, insidious stuff, and that people don't even know about. And slaves black people were invisible. My associates talk about friends. I have a black partner that's been incarcerated a lot of years up in Walpole. Mass. Nobody's dead, but he's incarcerated, and he writes about this stuff and the difference between northern slaves and northern blacks. You had a direct confrontation with them in southern blacks. In the North, no, because most people didn't even grow up around blacks. They were something else. That was not necessarily segregated in the sense, but they had lesser jobs, stuff like that. So your communities were separated. You could say, well, we don't have slaves. We don't do that. And the fact was, we, as you just said, economically and stuff like that, and the trades and everything else, it was horrendous what happened. And
Well, you can see the out and out with the abolitionists, how they got chased in New York and Philadelphia.
Race riots.
Race riots. A lot of people think, oh, well, it's just that was over. Well, the Civil War and stuff like that, but with huge race riots. We had huge race riots. Most people don't know about those things that happened.
One of the things that really impressed me, I think, was that despite the intense discrimination of that era, despite all of the obstacles that folks like Prudence Crandall faced, you had people who were standing up, both black and white, working together, understanding that slavery certainly was wrong, but also that discrimination and prejudice was wrong. It wasn't just an anti-slavery movement. That's what it was for some folks, but for Prudence Crandall, William Lloyd Garrison, and her immediate group of supporters, mostly the folks who taught at the school and worked with her, they firmly believed in equality for everyone, equal rights. And then, of course, Prudence Crandall extended that to not only equal rights and equality for all regardless of color, but all regardless of sex, because she became really a suffragette toward the end of her life, fighting for all the rights of women, the right to vote, and she saw discrimination against her not only from the point of view of those who objected to her teaching black women, but to those who objected to her as a woman holding a position of leadership, owning and running a school.
Yeah, she wasn't supposed to own anything. You were supposed to have to be a male in those days. And
that was the interesting part.
If she had been married, it would have the school would have been in her husband's name.
Right.
That would have been required by common law. The
right.
only way she was able to do this was because she was single.
It was really amazing how she managed to do that, because people were angry. They didn't like that. They went to the father, right? Was it?
They went to her father, Pardon Crandall. They went to her brother, Hezekiah. They said,
hey, pal,
get her
under control.
Yeah.
You sense in the book. That's you sense in the book they're driving. Get your daughter straightened out.
Right.
I thought about trying to straighten out mine. You can forget about it.
They run you.
Right? And especially the youngest one. But it's really all about these things. The thread, I mean, that was what's so amazing, again, in the work. How long?
Well, when I first found out about her story, I was invited to the Prudence Crandall Museum, and I want to put in a plug for the museum, because as we talk about this story, the amazing thing is that her schoolhouse stands to this day. Right. And it's owned by the state of Connecticut. It's a museum. You can Canterbury, you can go visit it, and Kaz Kozlowski is the curator there today. She was when I was first elected and invited me to go to the museum, so I did. I heard about her story, was intrigued by it for all the reasons we've talked about. So then I started to do research about it, because I thought, well, all right, Prudence Crandall is in my district. Her schoolhouse is in my district. Therefore, I want to know as much as I can about it.
Right?
And it got to a point where over time and reading more and different accounts and delving into it, I started finding little details that I had not seen written down elsewhere. Then I kind of got obsessed by it and realized that there's a wide variety of materials at the State Supreme Court Library, all about her trial, but also letters and other information. Connecticut College has a repository of information, more letters and documents. And so I started sifting through all this in some of my spare time. And there was a tipping point as I was discovering things where I had seen so many different things that had not been written down before, that I decided I needed to write something. There's another good biography that Susan Strain wrote back in the early 1990s called A Whole-Souled Woman, and I looked at that's a very good account of Prudence Crandall's life. But as I discovered more things that I had not seen there or anywhere else, I started writing, and it took me about 8 years. 8 years, because I had other things going on. this was a hobby. This is not my full-time job. So I had a very understanding wife, and I'd come home after a long day at the Capitol, and I would be able to kind of go off into this different world of abolitionists for an hour or two, and start chipping away at writing one chapter, then a second, then a third. And it's funny when you write a book. By the time you get into the fifth or sixth chapter, you go back and look at chapter one, and you realize that's terrible. I'm going to have to go. I probably rewrote chapter 1 4 or 5 times.
That's why I don't write. That's why I don't write. But I could tell with the detail and the work, and I knew, this wasn't a quickie book. This was long, researched out, and everything else. But again, the threads that run through the book. They drive you into wanting to find out other things. I mean, it was good for me because I have my associate and I. Okay, he's 47 years in prison. Okay, he studies my culture. I studied his culture back and forth. Okay, when I was very young, I had an integrated group and mixed. We were all mixed. And one of the things he had learned in prison was the Italians and the Irish all had a history. You know, they had a history. You talk about your ancestors and stuff like that. The blacks didn't have a history. I mean, maybe Afro, but it was about the neighborhood. Now, nobody really, most all of the black community inside, he said, this is crazy. You guys all got a history. So in the 70s, he started programs, Afro-American Tea, way back in the 70s, about, you know, finding out about culture, where people came from and stuff like that. And of course, over the years, we found education for changing individuals who have done the wrong thing and took the wrong path. Education is one of the key ways to help you get out of that, okay?
Absolutely.
It is really essential. So when you have no history, though, and you only have the neighborhood, I mean, you're like a lost soul. So, of course, he started studying, and then they got Afro, and he developed Afro studies in Walpole and Norfolk. So that's how we got on it. And, of course, you know, he'd say, yeah, did you read this? You know, you need to read about this. I said, I don't need to read about nothing, right? He said, come on. I said, well, if you read, I'll read your stuff, okay? But you need to read about Scotch history. You need to read about this history, okay? He said, oh, yeah, okay, well, so we've done it over years. So when I read this, I knew some of the characters that you touched on, the anti-slave people and stuff like that. But this blew my mind. I mean, and of course, again, it's written. I mean, we got Mark Twain in this state, but, you know, I love Mark Twain.
And he appears in this book, by the way.
He does.
Yeah.
He makes an appearance.
He makes an
on behalf
appearance.
of Prudence Crandall,
Right.
actually.
Don Williams, you gotta read his writing. I mean, he puts you right there. I mean, there's no, well,
Like I said, it's a whole picture.
Yeah.
I mean, the intertwining of relationships
is,
over an entire lifetime. And that's the part of her. And I think one of the things that really strikes me about Prudence Crandall, I mean, you're talking about the morality. And certainly a lot of that was based on spiritual or religious beliefs.
Yeah.
well,
But she changed different churches
Yes.
4 times throughout her lifetime.
Yes, she did.
And,
yeah.
and it struck me, she was drawn towards this sort of spiritualism, you know, throughout different points. And I know that's something that Father and I work from quite frequently is, you know,
yeah, it's
the spiritual
the
direction,
direction.
And how that really kind of guides you
Yeah.
within this. And you could just see how that was, you know, or touchstone throughout her life, and how it guided her in all different directions, right down to, I mean, she stayed with a man that probably wasn't that very nice to her, you know, and they spent time apart and were together, but still that level of loyalty.
Yeah, she was in an unhappy marriage
Yes.
to Calvin Filio, who was a Baptist minister, and Prudence Crandall was raised in a Quaker family, and then later migrated to the Baptist faith. And when she was running her school, was baptized in the Quinebaug River in northeastern Connecticut. But she was seeking, I would say, throughout her entire life. She was on a journey.
Right.
She wanted to teach throughout her life, I think because she realized that teaching could be a change agent for folks, that it gave, as Russ, you were saying, folks power, especially dispossessed folks. It gave you the ability to better yourselves and then to help others.
Yeah.
And that's what she wanted to do. And yes, Dominic, you're right. I think her religious faith absolutely was one of the key things that informed her decisions. That, and then being open to the influence of others who were also in some cases spiritual, and in other cases people who were abolitionists. So you had Samuel May, a Unitarian minister, a very strong supporter who worked closely with her, William Lloyd Garrison, who wasn't quite sure about religion, but absolutely was fighting for equality.
Equality.
And toward the end of her life, she was involved in a movement called spiritualism, which believed that you could communicate with spirits after loved ones died. And we might look back at that today and say, well, people thought they heard knocking sounds and voices of spirits and playing with Ouija board-like things, and it seems fairly gimmicky. But you have to remember, in the late 1800s, when this was popular, folks were learning about astronomy, and they were learning about electricity, and they were learning about all these forces in natures, and it didn't seem like that far of a leap that as you're thinking about electrical currents, as you're thinking about, as you're looking up in the stars and seeing the stars in an entirely different way, that you think to yourself, well, of course, there's got to be some energy left after someone dies, and isn't it possible to reach out, if we're through scientific discoveries finding out all these other pathways, then why wouldn't there be a pathway through spiritualism to contact the departed? So it was not so far a stretch for folks to believe, and you had not only Prudence Crandall, but William Lloyd Garrison. You had Susan B. Anthony, who was interested in spiritualism, Abraham Lincoln, and especially his wife, Mary. There were seances, spiritualist seances held in the White House during the Lincoln era.
Oh, yeah. I mean, well, it still goes on today. I mean, it's not, it's for some individuals, it still goes on today. And spiritualism, who's to say? I mean, I never make a judgment on anybody, wherever they are, whatever they believe, and everything else. People say, your belief is to yourself. Okay, I really believe in the sense that it's between you and whatever, however you determine that under your own definition. I have mine, other people have theirs, and I mean, we believe. I believe. I walk in the Spirit. I get up and do certain things, and
sometimes he texts you directly.
Yeah, we'll tell that on another show, right? It's people. Karma. I don't care whatever you call it. You do right. You learn. People need to learn to. That they are brothers and sisters, that we all live in this universe. We all are connected to one another in some ways, and I mean, and this slavery, this abusiveness that goes on is insidious. It's immoral. It's wrong, and we need to talk about it more. We need to, okay, this was then, we need to talk about all those evil things that happen and get it out and deal with it. And we don't. Putting it away doesn't help anything, as we are seeing in this across the country. Okay, I mean, you are my brother, whether you like me or not. It's too bad. Okay, I am my brother's keeper and my sister's keeper. We have to take care of those individuals that cannot take care of themselves. We have to. If we want a quality civilization, we need to lift up those who. And I mean that's what all this is about. I mean,
and throughout her life, that's what she wanted to do, because it was certainly about lifting up the dispossessed and certainly those who were discriminated against. But she later moved to Illinois and then lived the last decade of her life out in Elk Falls, Kansas. She continued to teach. She ran an informal school out of her home in both places, and taught the children of poor white families who needed an education. So, there was a lot about her story, especially when she was running the schoolhouse and was in communication with the abolitionist leaders in Boston and New York and Providence, that reminded me about the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 1960s, where you had this, even though we may think about it today, some people might think, oh, the civil rights movement in the 1960s, that's Martin Luther King, right?
That's right.
And you say, well, yes, it's Martin Luther King, but it's also thousands and thousands of other people,
yes,
and hundreds of leaders who were activists, but then thousands of the ground troops who put themselves out there in marches and in protests and in standing up for equality. And you know, Dominic, you were talking about all the various characters. It's not just a biography about Prudence Crandall. It's not one person. It was this significant group of folks who came together and worked together in a way that we see today, I think, when folks are fighting for equality and for the rights of all.
And that I guess maybe that's why I loved it so much, because you had all these people popping up in there. Okay, that if you did know the wider spectrum, you realize, hey, this guy's got a book about his own. His own life was something else. This person here is somebody else. And all these people come together, all of which have their own stories. And exactly, that's exactly what happens today. It's the unknown people who, I mean, that's what maybe is part of the thing that makes me love this so much, is there's so many that continue to work, that continue today, that you don't know about. You know what I mean? My saying is, you can change the world, right? How many times?
6.
With 6 people, as long as what?
As long as you don't take the credit for it.
Right? As long as you don't take the credit. If you're looking for the credit, see you later. You're in trouble. But that's what it takes. It takes everybody, you know, doing stuff. I mean, we do it with my street talk and my thing. I mean, I have a bunch of advocates that are behind the scenes and everything. And when you need them, and if you really need them, they get up and they do things. And it may be, you know, that's only an hour or two that they could do something, make a phone call, do whatever, go out and vote, you know, okay, but they do it, and if you don't want to do it, then, you know, don't complain.
Right, that's right.
One of the things that really struck me, like, within this, and I know we've had this discussion about precedents and certainly the legal arguments, but certainly I think the precedents that she showed in being willing to go to the point of being arrested in order to make sure that this, you know, was brought to trial. And then the 2 gentlemen that was Ellsworth
and Calvin Goddard.
And the arguments that they made. I mean, we talk about law, and most people look back on what laws have been written or what arguments have been made. But the precedent setting that happened within this case, and also within the Connecticut Supreme Court, that this could have literally gone up to the Supreme Court had it not been for, like, them trying to find a way to wiggle out of it, or
It was cowardice,
technicality.
Simple. Yes.
We might have had a different point of view as to, you know, having the Supreme Court actually having to rule on this prior to the Civil War.
If the majority of the state Supreme Court at that time had done what they wanted to do, which was to rule that the black law was unconstitutional, we'd probably all know their names. We'd probably all know the names of those justices, because their names would be written much larger in American history. And that would have been a decision that would have been appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. John Marshall was still the Supreme Court Chief Justice at that time. And I make an argument in the book that it would have been unlikely, but not out of the realm of possibilities, that you would have had a U.S. Supreme Court outcome upholding some form of black citizenship, at least for free blacks, and which would have opened the door to a recognition of civil rights for all so much earlier in American history. But at minimum, we would have set down a marker. Even if the Supreme Court had dodged that case, or had not ruled, or if they did rule on it, not ruled favorably, the state of Connecticut would have set down a marker saying these kind of laws, that this discriminatory black law is unconstitutional, and that would have been validated by history. But instead, the 3 justices were afraid to take on the Chief Justice, who was David Daggett, who was also the lower court judge. Unbelievable at this time that how people thought about or didn't think about conflicts of interest.
Right.
Here was someone who was, as a Supreme Court justice, sitting in judgment of his own decision
Of his
in a
own-
lower court.
I know, it was amazing, wasn't it?
And the other three associate justices didn't want to embarrass him by overruling his decision when he was the Chief Justice of the Connecticut State Supreme Court. So they more or less invented a technicality and decided to throw the case out on this invisible technicality.
It is, like I said, all attorneys need to read the book.
And my background in law helped me a lot, obviously, when I was looking at the pleadings, trying to find that technicality, looking at the original the documents at the State Supreme Court Library, and then all of a sudden realizing, I can't believe this. The technicality that they said was there, I'm not finding.
You're not finding.
And but I also have a journalism background too, so I didn't want to tell the story in a legalistic, inaccessible, dusty historian kind of way. I wanted to tell it in a way that folks could ideally wrap their arms around and understand.
Well, I don't know if you know or not. I'm in partnership with a publisher. We have Little Red Cell, and we publish books from, if they're quality books, from people like that are behind the walls that couldn't afford or couldn't be able to get their voice out. It's part of the ministry that I do. And it's real interesting because I don't want to insult anybody, but you don't write like an attorney. Lawyers write.
No.
You know what I mean, right?
That was right.
I didn't realize that because I was going to ask. You got me. I was going to ask you. Well, you know, I know you're an attorney, but you don't write like. But it's your journalistic background that's okay. Because I was trying to figure out, because I did know that you were an attorney, and obviously with the legal background, I'm saying, but journalists are not authors.
Well, first.
And I mean, attorneys are not authors most of the time.
Right.
They just,
I mean,
they write different.
A lot of historians I'm in awe of, and even though I took a lot of history classes in college, I don't profess to be a historian. There are some just tremendous books about this era that I use as touchstones and that are cited throughout the footnotes. But attorneys, yes, we have a passion sometimes for writing in very dense ways that sometimes can be incomprehensible.
Yeah, exactly right.
So I wanted to tell that side of the story, but that's when I had to really rely on that journalism background and remind myself, don't get way into the weeds here. Tell the story and explain it in a way that can connect with folks. And I hope, I hope I succeeded, especially in those legal aspects.
Well,
of the book.
I think you did, and I mean, obviously, I want to make sure that our people get out there and read this book. This is a nice read. This is really a nice read. This is a great book to read. It's a good book. I nurtured it because I didn't want to end it quick. I slowed it down because I love the writing. Okay, so it is a story. I mean, you can get right into the movie aspect in your head by the way you wrote this. Okay, a lot of books you can't do. I just finished The Great Reformer on Pope Francis. Right. Wonderful book. Wonderful book. Everybody should read that book too. However, it was exhausting. It was so detailed and stuff like that. It was an exhausting read. But if you want to know about the Pope, who he is and what he's about, that's a book to read. This was a joy. It was really a nice read and a joy to read. And you're getting all this serious
Well,
stuff.
some parts in the story blew my mind. I mean, the last chapters, when you're talking about Brown versus Board of Ed, and certainly I didn't know any of this, the Chief Justice passed away.
Frederick Vinson, yes.
Right before.
Right in the middle of the case.
Right in the middle of this case.
Yeah.
And Eisenhower appoints Earl Warren.
A Republican governor from California who'd never been a judge before.
Onto this case.
Yeah.
And it was looking like Judge Vincent was probably going in the opposite direction. And
He could have been the fifth vote against overruling segregation. In other words, for upholding segregation. And that, according to William O. Douglas, when they did the quick vote after the initial arguments, it was 5-4 in favor of upholding segregation. So you're right. Then Judge Vincent had a heart attack.
That's just amazing. And then what Earl Warren did within that, as a legislator, to be able to pull those people together, and he wanted a unanimous decision to be able to really, set the marker down and say that this is the direction that we need to go morally. I mean, that was just, I finally read the last chapter 2 days ago. The only time I can read is when my 5-year-old's like asleep, so I'm up at like 2:30 in the morning actually reading this to make sure I got through it. And I was just like in shock.
Yeah.
I didn't know any of this stuff.
Yeah, people, we might think that it was just the inevitable arc of history, that of course segregation would be overruled, and too bad that it took up to 1954 to get it done, but you delve into that case and you realize it was a close call. That, matter of fact, when they had that initial 5-4 vote, the 4 justices who were in the minority at that time, who wanted to strike down segregation, were shocked and sort of terrified the idea that there might be a decision to uphold segregation, and argued persuasively for a do-over, which the Supreme Court hardly ever does, which is, you know what, why don't we come back in a few months and let the parties argue the case all over again, but this time, don't give us the social science evidence. That doesn't give us a constitutional basis to strike down segregation. This time, argue the 14th Amendment. And that's where the Prudence Crandall case had some influence.
It is amazing stuff. I mean, it really is amazing stuff, and it really is. The timeline isn't that far away. I mean, this is one of the most difficult things in our country. This is not taught. This is not talked enough about. We don't discuss this enough. In the ins and outs and all this stuff, we don't do it. And by not doing it, we continue the immorality that goes on. 13th Amendment still holds slavery. 13th Amendment, everybody says, well, slavery is over. No, it ain't. All you got to do is read the 13th Amendment. You get a felony charge, you become a slave. We just changed ownership from private to state. Okay, now I had an ancestor relative that said, no, you can't do that. Nobody should be allowed to own people. Even in cases of war, okay, you have no right. You can incarcerate and stuff like that, but you can't. Servitude is immoral. And we still have it. We still have it, an amendment. We fight from the justice standpoint, to this very day, that if you're convicted of a crime, it's the only way you can have slaves. And a lot of people don't read it. They don't know their 13th Amendment. Well, I happen to because
it made me go back and I did read through all the amendments and how amendments. Some of them are still held open. There's the Corwin Amendment is which was for segregation, obviously, and slavery back in, I think it was 1850 or somewhere in around there. Some of these amendments are still, that they've tried to put through, are still held open because there was no date tied to them, strangely enough.
Well, luckily the 14th and the 15th Amendment control
on
issues like slavery as we knew it prior to the Civil War. Yeah. Right. No one would argue that that's
But that's why I said I'm reading through this. I'm looking at what amendments have been proposed,
You don't know
and I'm just, flabbergasted. It's some of them that are still held open because there was no date. Unlike other things that, you talk about Prudence Crandall, the Equal Rights Amendment didn't pass. And I mean, to look at somebody like her, I guess I can't understand why this hasn't, been brought up to try another time again within our society.
Well, she was a fighter for equal rights for all, and especially women as well. And when you think about it, when she was being persecuted and she had admitted Sarah Harris and was teaching other black women at her school, they held town meetings in the town of Canterbury to pass resolutions against her school. Now, when they did that, because she was a woman, she could not attend and defend herself. She could not
Yeah,
speak
man, I know.
in public
That is
because not only could women not
I know.
vote, they couldn't vote until 1919, but they could not speak in public at meetings. And she was part of another movement, the temperance movement, which was out to eradicate alcohol and the evils of alcohol. And it was a movement largely driven, not exclusively driven, but largely driven by women. Businessmen became very interested too because they didn't want drunken workforces. But the majority of folks within the temperance societies were women. When they held their public meetings, the only folks who could speak were men at the public meetings. Such was the state of inequality. And what's fascinating to me is today, even though we have made tremendous progress, and I think we all have to agree that the progress of America, as I like to say when I have these book discussions, I believe the progress of America can be measured by the success we've had in the fight for equality over time. And we have had tremendous success. And yet, we still can't today say that every issue regarding equality is over regarding people of color. We can't say it's over regarding women. And there are new frontiers, gay and lesbian rights. So the quest for true equality in America goes on. But I think if you look at some of the best chapters in the history of this country, it's when we took steps forward to guarantee opportunity and equality for all. And it is a struggle that continues.
And it is, and you know what? I'm watching my time. I can't believe this show is almost over. I was so glad to have you on the show. I mean, really. And again, the book is fabulous. We know the struggle goes on. Yeah, we're all in it. Everybody at this table are all in it, and we'll continue to do it. I'm going to love to have you back if I can ever get you back
we'd
on here
love to
again
do that.
and talk about it. And of course, to my audience, we're going to continue. I'm going to talk about how the Irish became white, okay, which comes around the same time as this was going on, and will be discussed in some of our other shows. We hope that you all enjoyed this. Dominic, we
come back at 8 o'clock.
Kathy
Austin.
Have dinner and come back. Get a little relaxed at that point.
Well, we got a lot of good shows coming
Yes.
up, right?
Yes.
Okay, we got next week.
Next week, we got Representative McGee.
McGee's going to be here next
good.
week.
To discuss race relations.
Race relations, right, and then
We got my boxing
we're
trainer.
going to be talking about boxing, right? So, look, we've got about 6 weeks of great shows coming up. Please follow us, Dawn. God bless you.
Thank you, Russ.
So happy
Incredible.
that you were
So incredible to have you here.
incredible
Thank you.
book. Listen, okay, I'm telling you, go get this book. It should be a movie, okay? Wahlbergs, you know, I know y'all. Get on it. Get this book. Get Dom to make a movie, okay? Yeah, I know the Wahlbergs. They're Boston boys. You ought to know that, right? God bless. We love you. See you next week.